when I was younger, I wanted to be Britney Spears. Today I have enough data, like I'm not Britney Spears, but enough data to certainly say I definitely do not want to be Britney Spears or anyone of that caliber of fame.
What other ways have you found to spot talent or spot talented people?
I have definitely noticed that trend, and I think there's a couple important points to this, which is one, like nonfiction, a lot of the books say the same thing. You don't know what skills are important. Well, the skill that will always be important is learning how to build a narrative. People will let you know if you're creating something worthwhile.
Steph, thank you for coming on the podcast. Really grateful and honored for you to be here. I was listening to episode 35 of this podcast right when I started.
Oh my gosh.
And it is wild. It is wild to see the difference in how I would say things. And so I'm so grateful for you being here today for episode 339. But
I was
also
going to ask where you're at now. 10x? Was I really that early?
Yeah, you were early. And for that, for putting up with me at that stage, as well as coming on today, I'm really grateful. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And what's funny is I'm at a similar stage with my new job. I think I'm at around episode 30. So I'll have to check in with you when I'm at episode 300, because I feel like I'm in a similar spot. A lot to learn.
Yeah, well, we'll get into the new podcast. But before we do, I want to ask about, I feel like if I listen to that episode 30, and then hopefully someone listens to this one today, they'll notice a clear, distinct improvement from everything.
Hopefully both of us.
Yeah, hopefully. But I'm curious for you, what is the thing that you feel like you've made the most improvement at in your entire life?
Well, remind me, what year were we in? How long ago? Where was I? I think I was in Encinitas. I remember filming it, I think. But I don't know. I think 2020. Was it 2021?
Yeah, it was December 2020.
Okay. So pandemic has hit. We've been inside for like most of the year. At that time, I was working at the Hustle. I mean, I don't know if there's any specific part of me where I'm like, wow, since then, like I've totally changed. But I mean, it's kind of crazy to see what's happened since then. Like at that time, I was working at the Hustle. We hadn't been acquired yet. Then I worked at HubSpot. I built the creator program. Somehow I'm at A16Z now. Now I'm a podcast host too. So it's funny because back then, none of that was on the radar.
You are so good, I feel, at flowing with life, but also having structure. How do you do that?
Well, I think I have maybe the right level of selfishness where a lot of people will, I think, cater to other people's expectations. Also, it could be their parents saying like, oh, I really wanted you to go down this career path, or, hey, I've worked with this boss for 10 years. I can't leave them. Like, again, I think I have a layer of selfishness, and maybe there's a more positive word I could use there, but where I just inevitably drift towards the things that excite me. And I have a little bit of risk aversion, or enough to balance out my selfishness, where I think I've found the right balance of prioritizing what I want to do when I want to do it, but also not being that person who's like hopping between jobs every 3 months kind of thing.
Have you ever had a period of your life where you weren't doing what excited you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that was what started me on this path. And there's been inklings of that in jobs since. But when I was doing the job in business consulting, the first job out of college, I was like, this isn't it. I mean, it was for multiple reasons. The job was interesting, but I was commuting 2 hours a day. We probably talked about this last time we chatted, but there have definitely been times in my career where I'm like, this doesn't feel right. And sometimes it's not the right option, but I've also learned, like even in this job to start, I mean, maybe people will be surprised with my new job at A16Z. Like the first few months, I felt totally out of my depth, where I was like, am I supposed to be a podcast host? Like, I'm now representing this big firm and these really intelligent people. And so sometimes there is a balance between like knowing whether something's actually not right and knowing when you need to lean into something uncomfortable and improve at it. Especially I found that later in my career, because there's this expectation now where I'm like, oh, I'm good at things. So now, the next thing, or good at some things, I should say. So the next thing, maybe I'll be good at that. And I've now seen, oh, well, that's not always the case.
Well, take us through how you got the role as a podcast host previously never, I mean, you had shit you don't learn in school like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a podcast. I'm sure that was your resume, your digital resume, but how did that podcast come to be?
Yeah, so they reached out, and to your point, it's not like I had 10 years of experience being a podcast host. On one end, no one really does. I mean, very few people have that resume today because we are early, but I think it was maybe the right combination. I mean, you'll have to ask A16Z in the end because I was not on the other side of the hiring table, but I think maybe the combination of someone who had some experience with podcasting, I was also helping HubSpot build their podcast network, but also maybe a track record of just working towards interesting things. Like, again, you'll have to ask them, but I think there maybe was a bet of like, look at what she's done with Twitter or with her blog or with her book or with other companies, and the people who have hired her say great things. So, you know, maybe there's a track record there where maybe even though she doesn't have, again, 10 years of experience, I'm sure you've heard this idea of like hire for slope, not y-intercept, right? So it's this idea of like hire for where someone can get instead of where they are today. And so I think there was maybe an element of that too.
Yeah. And when I was doing research for this and stalked through your Twitter, I was like, oh my God, this woman is just a treasure trove of interesting nuggets about the internet and
Thank
just
you.
in general. And I feel like your Twitter account, just a great place to go to learn more about the world and where it's headed. So how does somebody become better at that?
Well, I mean, I think for a while I had a job where my job was to find things that people do not know about but would like to know about once they become exposed to it. So that was trends. And I think, I mean, I learned all types of tactical skills, like what websites to go down the rabbit hole in, whether it's subreddits, whether that's actually using tools like Ahrefs or SimilarWeb. But I think the thing that I learned the most, and we trained all of our analysts on this, which is most of our ideas people thought came from those tools, and they didn't. Those tools would help us validate an idea or a concept, but most of those ideas came from everyday life. And so that would be walking down the street and just asking the right questions, like this grass that exists, like how is this grass mowed every day? Like this isn't on someone's lawn, this is just like in the city. Or like this other thing, you know, this happened on an airplane recently where like for the first time I got, instead of like a true lime or lemon, they have these like packets, which is like crystallized lime and lemon, and they taste amazing. And I was like, who's making this? How much are they doing in revenue? Why didn't this exist before? Like, was there some sort of like unlock? Is there a patent here? There's other newsletters like Patent Drop where you can literally see what some of the largest companies in the world are paying attention to. And so it's that same eye for like, there's infinite things happening in the world around us, whether it's our friends, families, coworkers, the homeless person on the street. If you pay attention and you just ask questions, you will uncover things. And then that's when the tools come in. That's when you look at Google Trends and you say, oh, hard kombucha. I only see this in San Diego, nowhere else. This is a couple years ago as an example. Let me look into that. Oh, when I pull this up, I see this up into the right graph. And then when I look at the localized version, my hypothesis is confirmed. It's like concentrated in California. And so that's an example of, you know, this is kind of a wind-about way of answering your question, but it's really about asking the right questions and then using those tools to like validate what people actually find interesting.
So now that you're a podcast host, you are forced to ask questions for a living, basically.
Yes.
And I as well, I keep lists of questions and questions. I'm curious, have you figured out like your favorite questions to ask, or do you have a list somewhere? Because I know you're a big list person. Do you have a list of your favorite questions?
Oh my gosh. I do have a list of what I'll call, a question that can resonate with anyone, or anyone might have an interesting answer to it. So for example, initially we were actually going to use this as the final question. You know how there's sometimes that like billboard question at the end of certain podcasts. Tim Ferriss used to have one. I think Dax Shepard has one. And mine was, we didn't end up going with it, but on an episode of Tim Ferriss, he's talking to Alex Honnold. And Alex Honnold, for people who aren't familiar, he's the free solo guy. He climbs all of these mountains without any gear, and people think he's crazy. And Tim asks, like, okay, Alex, I know you don't think so about yourself, but you're kind of crazy. Is there anyone else that you think that you're inspired by, that you are like shocked by the same way that people are shocked by you? And he talked about this guy, Marc-Andre Leclerc. If you haven't heard of The Alpinist, that's the guy that film is based off of. I'm not going to ruin that film, but this guy is crazier than Alex Honnold. And I wanted to ask that same question to all the founders out there, because the types of people that come on the A16Z podcast have tons of fans, followers, people who are impressed by them. But it's like, who are they impressed by? And even better, in the case of Marc-Andre Leclerc, it was someone who no one else had heard of. Like, we're not talking about these like FANG company CEOs. We're not talking about the founders everyone has heard of. I would love to hear, again, like people who are, again, that underground layer. So that was one example of a question. But Danny, I don't know if you found the same. I basically have to come up with a majority, if not all the questions individual to the person, because I just find that, you know, even though I do have those fallback questions, they often result in like really vague answers as well.
Yeah, I love the underground heroes, or the people who are going to that shape our mentors in the world, or the people that we look up to are the people who that help us navigate our own lives so much.
Yeah.
So it helps. It makes me ask, who are those people for you?
Oh gosh, now I'm like, damn, I don't know if I have a good answer to this. It's funny, I recorded another podcast this morning, and this is going to sound really strange, because there's absolutely people external that I look up to, but we were talking about how there was a period of my life when I was a lot younger. I mean, I'm not very old, but even like a decade ago, where I just had so much confidence, and I was like, no one knew who I was, and I just made decisions based on this idea of like I had nothing to lose. And sometimes when I'm looking for that confidence a little later in my life, where I have built up maybe more of a following, more of this expectation, where people, when they hear, like, let's say I write something or I come out with a podcast episode, there's a level of expectation paired with that. And sometimes, especially lately, as I ventured into this new world, I've been trying to tap back into that person, which was, I know, again, it sounds kind of crazy, but like me 10 years ago, where I've just built up this, I guess, level of expectation, this pressure. And so that's actually been something I've been trying to get my head back into, if that makes sense.
This is so fascinating, because it's like when you're in that place 10 years ago of quote unquote trying to make it, you're putting yourself in the position of the person you are today. But the person you are today is putting yourself in the position of the person you were. Fascinating, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like the grass is always greener, but I've been trying to, I have an article in progress about this, and the title I have currently is this, it's called The Joy of Inconsequence. Just this idea that, like, I mean, to your point, when you're younger, all you want is people to, you know, care about what you're doing, to follow your thoughts, to think you're smart. And then when you get there, you're like, man, it was really nice when no one had any expectation. When no one knew who I was. And I know you hear a lot of famous people saying that, and I don't in any way think I'm a famous person, but you see inklings of that once you build a following, and you're like, man, it was pretty joyful to have zero consequences with my actions, at least, you know, in the scope that I'm talking about it in. And so, yeah, I think there's something wise there.
What are some of the drawbacks or the things that people might not think about when they have a lot of people following their work?
Well, I think, you know, this is related to what I was just saying, but there's an element when people are listening where you just can't say everything that you think or feel. And I mean, a simple representation of this is what anyone would say to one friend across the room is just simply not what they'd be comfortable saying in a room full of 1,000 people if they're giving a talk. Right. And that's just natural. People are going to disagree with you. But again, there's this like consequence to what you do, to what you say. And in some ways that's good, because once you do have a following, you have a level of responsibility. But I think that's another thing where it's just like in everything you do, you have this, I don't know, this filter. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of, you know, larger creators push back on that filter, and they come out one day and they say like, actually, I'm just going to say what I really think here. But yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. I also think there's the safety angle. Like, I haven't run into anything really, knock on wood, but as you build a following, like, I mean, if you've read the Tim Ferriss article on this, it's like, it can get pretty scary. And so I don't know, it's funny because, this parallel of when you're younger, you hear all these things and you don't believe them. Like, this is another example of that where I'm like, when I was younger, I wanted to be Britney Spears. Today I have enough data, like I'm not Britney Spears, but enough data to certainly say I definitely do not want to be Britney Spears or anyone of that caliber of fame. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's definitely these things where once you build a following, you're like, oh, I was told this, but now I understand.
Well, it's interesting, like how what we try to do is the person we are trying to become is often not in alignment with what that person wants when that person becomes the thing. So I'm fascinated by this too, like building a life that we want at one point, but then we end up don't wanting. How much of this for you and building a following and your competitive drive was because your sister was smarter than you?
You dug this up just like your other podcasts. I don't know. I mean, I definitely think it played a role because, I mean, sibling dynamics, like, it's so funny because today a lot of people, at least the people I work with directly, are like, you're really smart. And it's funny because in the context of my childhood, it was this double-sided coin where it's like, I knew I was smart because I made it into the gifted program. I won math competitions. I played chess for Team Canada, but I was still like not nearly as smart as not only my sister, but like within the gifted program, I can say with certainty I was like not in the top half of like, if you were to look at just kind of technical intelligence. And so, yeah, I think there's been like a competitive side to me since I was a child to like prove myself. One example of this is I was in grade 3 and I think she was in grade 5, but there was a math competition where basically grade 3, 4, and 5 would all take the same test, but like grade 3 would only take the first 30 questions, 40 and 50 for each grade. And that meant that we were taking the first 30 questions, the same first 30 questions together, me and my sister. And I remember us like talking to my dad after about the questions. And there was this one where we disagreed and we were like, no, it's this one. And she's like, no, it's this one. And we got back the scores and I got 29 out of 30, which meant we already knew I got a different one wrong, but that meant I got that one right. And you can tell like how much this drives me. But I was like, I did it, like this is grade 3. What is that when you're 8 or something like that? And so, yeah, I think it does drive me. I think there's this embedded competitive side of me that I don't know if will ever disappear. But I will say it, like, I think it partially comes from that, but I think it partially comes from my parents always, I don't know how they did this, but they instilled this idea that like you are really smart and you can do anything. And I don't know how they like pass that on, not just in like a theoretical way, but a really tangible way where I believe that. And so I think there's something there too, where I feel the need to prove that, yes, I like, not only did they say I can do anything, but like now I will do that, if that makes sense.
If you had to guess, how did they do that?
I've been trying to figure this out because I even remember in school, many other kids, like I said, I was in a gifted program. There's many other kids from other parts of the world where, I remember on weekends they'd be studying and I'd not be doing that. My parents never checked on my grades. And so I think this happened at a very early age. I need to ask them about this because even in high school, I would be the one checking my grades, if that makes sense. Like I'd be like, oh, I'm really bummed that I got like an 87 on this. My parents didn't care. If anything, my mom was like, you need to get outside. You need to
go ahead
enjoy
and smell
life.
Some grass.
She's always, even to this day, still telling me that I need to relax. I need to, work less. And so, you know what? I'm going to have to ask them. And then once we follow up on episode 600, then, I'll come back with a better answer.
With the parenting piece, I find it so fascinating, especially for people who feel as if they've been parented really well. Because I think it is an unlock for so much success and so much greatness that you achieve later in life. What are some of the ways you've been parented well in your own life?
Yeah, so I think it's funny because parenting is one of these things where you don't get an A/B test. But at the same time, there's certain things that my parents did where I'm sure if it was run through an A/B test, things would go differently with a different child. But like, for example, they gave me ultimate freedom, which is why I think I'm, as I used the term selfish earlier, but like I really do want to like roam and explore and do everything that I want to do. And that's because like they did not restrict me. And that was in every dimension. That meant there was like, if we wanted pop in the house, there was pop in the house. If I wanted to sleep over at a friend's house, like they weren't checking in on me, there was no curfew. But that's why, again, like there's something about their parenting style that I don't quite understand how it worked out, because in another scenario, maybe a kid would just go like, instead of actually sleeping over at their friend's place, like go be on the street doing drugs, or like, you know, it could go down a very different path. Similarly, they weren't checking on my grades. And so I easily could have been failing, you know, instead of getting straight A's. But I do think, you know, upon reflection, this sounds really minor, but something I do remember them doing, and I think it was genuine, like you can't fake this, is they would tell other, whether it's other parents, their sisters and brothers, like they would tell them about me and my sister and just be really proud. And so, and again, it was genuine. It wasn't a bragging thing. It would be like, did you hear that like Steph like won this, you know, this math competition, or that they made it to this rating in chess? And again, there was this deep belief that they really thought we could be great.
Wow.
And they didn't pressure us in the day-to-day to do that, but almost like in the periphery of hearing them say those things and actually believing them. Like, I think that's how they really built into me, where I was like, oh yeah, like I can do this.
Wow. I love that last example, because it reminds me of Alex Hormozy's principle around giving someone a compliment. He said the best way to give someone a compliment is to walk ahead of them a little bit so they think that you can't hear them, and then you tell someone else right next to you about something good. And the person that is being complimented is feeling like, oh, wow, they're saying something nice about me and they don't expect anything from me. And it reminds me exactly of what your parents did. And it's super cool. And it's like, how can we, I think us saying to someone else something good is the best way to give a compliment, almost, because it is genuine.
It's genuine. And to your point, like, well, sometimes it's uncomfortable to say it to a person directly. And even if you do, it's just this loaded nature to it where it's like, oh, do I compliment you back? Like, are you just saying this because you want to be my friend or because you want to impress me? But yeah, when you say it to someone else, it does feel so nice if you're on the periphery of that, of hearing that about yourself, where you're like, someone actually liked my work or me or some aspect of me enough to go and tell someone else that. And I think that's, you know, even just coming off this call, I'm like, I should go do that. I should go do that more. And like, that's just such a sweet thing to do, to compliment other people to a third party.
Yeah, absolutely. So your goal when you were just getting started in life was to go ahead and buy an ice cream at the mall.
Yes. Yeah.
Why was that so important to you?
Well, now, Danny, since you've done your research, I have to take you to this mall one day and show you this ice cream. I mean, first of all, I've been saying ice cream, but it's actually this like really great frozen yogurt. And it was back then, I mean, inflation, but I think it was like $3, maybe $4 max. But back then it was like, so the ice cream, I think, was just a representation of this idea that eventually I want to get to the point where I can buy things and not constantly be doing math to figure out if it's, you know, if it's the right thing, or to be budgeting, or to feel bad about myself if I do choose to buy something that's not necessary. And like, my parents were not wealthy, but they also, I think, just went into a bunch of debt for my sister and I. So we would get things, but there was this embedded, not because they wanted to show us this, but, you know, you just end up learning these things through life, that they were in that debt. So there was this understanding of like, oh gosh, we really shouldn't spend.
How did you find that out? How did you find out that they went into debt? If you don't mind sharing.
I mean, it's hard to remember now, but I think it was just like, you know, parents fighting, and then like more so again, like tangentially hearing it. Like, I don't think my parents ever sat us down and was like, look at our bank account, like this isn't good. And you could just get the sense of like, because my mom was the more, at least in this sense, generous one of like, we should give them the childhood that they want. But then you could sense this tension of like, we really shouldn't be buying this stuff, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, there was just always this like and still is this tension in my head of like, can you afford this? Like, you shouldn't have any debt. Like, I paid off my debt from college. I was around $30,000 in debt, which is nothing compared to most Americans, but I think that's like close to the max you can even get to in wow. Canada. And so my first year after college, it was like my number one goal, like pay off this debt. You don't want debt. And still, anyway, coming back to the ice cream thing, I think I've gotten past ice cream or like a coffee, but there's still so many things, you know, when you're at a restaurant and you're comparing prices and there's something that's $17 that you want, but then there's another thing that's $13 that's like good enough. And so I think there's still those mind games where even though I make more today than honestly I ever could have imagined as a kid, there's still these things where I'm like, even today I was like, what do I wear to a podcast? Like every time I record a podcast, I was like, should I look nice? And then I'm like, I don't own nice clothes. Like I haven't gotten past that point of upgrading my wardrobe, even though now I can afford it.
That's so fascinating. How sometimes money doesn't unlock the thing that we actually need to unlock a new sense of freedom for our own actions and behaviors, yeah. Which is funny because the assumption is when you're in that place that it will, but it doesn't for a lot of people. It doesn't.
Or it takes a lot of learning or unlearning as well, but it takes actually concentrated effort to be like, I need to like rejigger my brain so that it works differently when I encounter, you know, these scenarios where you want to spend, but then your past is kind of training you not to.
What I'm hearing from a lot of what you're talking about is that there was a lot of listening that you did without any implication of anything said to you. For example, your parents being proud of you without them explicitly telling you were listening to them telling other people. And the debt was like, they didn't tell you we're in debt, but you yeah. listened and you heard that. So I guess a skill that you had to learn at a young age was the skill of listening. And it's funny now that you're a podcast host and that makes sense. But talk to me about listening as a skill. How have you gotten better at that? Or is that just a natural thing that you've always had?
No, I think I'm actually not a natively great listener. I genuinely don't think I think I'm improving at it, but I don't think that's something that was like handed to me or even from, you know, these early encounters. Maybe there's elements of that, of what I would say more so like analyzing the world. But I actually think there's a difference between analyzing the world and like listening when someone's speaking, especially. Like that's something as a podcast host. I mean, you've got more reps than I do, but just the balance of listening and not planning at the same time, or at least balancing that and truly hearing what someone is saying and responding to that versus, I mean, especially when I, like the first few episodes, I had way over prepared and I was like really stressed that, you know, there would be awkward moments and that I wouldn't know what to say. And so I was more so planning versus listening. And so that is something that you know, there have been several skills in my life, whether it's like becoming an Excel wizard or like learning to code, where a lot of people are like, that's so impressive. But in the last year with this new job, the most important skills I'm learning now are these soft skills of like listening, becoming a better speaker, right? Like relating to people. And it's so funny because a lot of these people are like, I learned that when I was, you know, like 16. And I'm like, well, that's great. I'm, you know, catching up in a way where it's not that I think I'm impersonal, but it's more so like, these are skills, right, to learn. And I actually think I'm curious to hear from you, like, how have you found, like, in the realm of listening, how have you worked on that and become a better listener as a podcast host?
Yeah, I mean, people can go back and listen to episode 35 and see the differences, but it's very much a thing of reps, and it's very much a thing of being present with self. The more present you can be with yourself, the more you can meditate and actually listen to yourself or have a dedicated time to listen to yourself, the better you're going to get as a listener to other people. How could you listen to someone else if you haven't listened to yourself first and heard what that voice is saying? That's been my experience of it. And I'm curious if you've done any meditation.
Not so much meditation, but I do think, you know, there's an interesting nature to podcasting. I don't know if you've found the same thing, but with many other skills, you don't feel this ego behind like, oh, if I'm not like, you know, this 10x developer, it's okay. Like I can code and I can build things, and like there's no ego or like disappointment if you're not great at it or if you get some negative feedback. I've found with the podcast, like most of the feedback has been really positive, but every so often, you know, there's this little thing and I'm like, I'm really hurt by those, as in like I'm more attuned to like, it feels like it's me, if that makes sense, because it's like it's like my face, my voice, like the thing that I'm creating. And it's not like I'm going down and like getting, you know, totally butthurt from one comment, but it's interesting because I do think that there's, you know, you mentioned meditation, but like there is a, I don't know, like a processing of this new job that I'm doing and like trying to dissociate like the product from my personality or my like person even. And so I don't know if you've gone through any of the same thing, but it's like, that's a work in progress. And yeah, curious to hear if you've like experienced any of that too.
There's very little someone could say to me that could impact me at a deep level because I'm comfortable with myself. But I'm curious to dive into some of the things that have impacted you, if you'd be open to exploring them, and what about them triggers you or makes you feel uncomfortable.
Well, yeah, I think there's a difference between with other work I've done. I think it's specifically the podcast, this new venture, which has been thrilling, and I'm so glad I'm getting to do this and improve at the skill, or I guess suite of skills that we just talked about. But it's like, I think it's two things. There's a difference between when someone says, hey, like, I disagree with your tweet, or like, this blog article didn't really jive with me, versus because a podcast is, again, so much more the fidelity of like your voice, your personality. When you get negative commentary, like, I'm getting better at this, but it's been harder to separate the two and be like, oh, actually, I can still be like this wonderful, impressive, creative, intelligent person, and someone can actually not like my podcast, if that makes sense. Versus that was not a hard thing to do with other I guess creative endeavors. But I also think there's this relationship between where I'm at in my career, where I talked about this like this joy of inconsequence, where like I don't think I cared what other people thought earlier on because no one had an expectation of me. And I also think my expectation of myself was lower. And so now I'm at a point where I'm like proud of what I've done and I know what I can be capable of. So I think there's also an element of being harder on myself where I'm like, oh, especially, by the way, if some sort of commentary has truth to it. Like I think I saw someone in this group chat that I'm in who was asking, they were like, hey, their following was growing. They're like, naturally, as you grow your following, I'm starting to get a little more negative feedback, or at least like it's filtering in to me. And so like, how have you all dealt with it? And something that I mentioned was just like, I find it really interesting because some feedback doesn't get to me at all. And then some feedback does. And I've found the through line on the stuff that gets to me, it often has a kernel of truth. And so what I'm trying to do is get to the point where it sounds like you're at, which is hear the feedback, use it to improve, but also not let it kind of dismantle your confidence. And so that's something I do feel like I'm making progress there, but I would say that is something that I've noticed as well.
I find this happens so often when someone goes from success in one area to now a new domain. And I've seen this happen to many different creators that I can think of, where it's like they'll start to get insecure because they don't put in their head that they're starting back from square zero at something, but now they have the added pressure of so many more eyeballs.
Exactly.
So I know this is something you're dealing with, and it's like, and how do you think about this? Because I'm sure that podcasting is going to be something I do, but it's not going to be something I do it's not going to be the next thing that I do is going to be something else where I'm going to have to start at square zero. So what comes to mind for ways in which people should handle this most effectively?
Well, I mean, because I've been going through this, I think there's a couple things that have been helpful reminders. Maybe aspects of this will resonate and others won't. But like one of them is the reminder that like whatever I'm doing today is like, it is the beginning of that learning curve. And so like I was talking to my husband and he's like, go listen to the early Tim Ferriss episodes. Like go listen to, insert podcaster who you know and love today and like go listen to their early stuff. And he's like, and you're on episode what? And so like get those reps in and check back in. Like it's not so much that he was being dismissive, but he was just like, you're not at the point where like you should be the best podcaster in the world. And so I think that's a helpful reminder. I also think, again, like we just spoke to this, but like the separation of like my worth, my intelligence, the way I view myself is not, it may touch, but it's not identical to like how I do in one specific arena, especially as I said, if I'm early on in that process. And then also just like experimenting. I think a lot of the time, you know, you give other people advice and then you don't take your own. But like what I would tell someone to do in this position, if they're just starting out, is like, go find your voice. Like go try different types of episodes, different formats, see what works, get a lot of feedback, even if some of it hurts. And then, you know, with time, you will find your voice. And just like every other thing you've done, like if you bring the right attitude, you bring the right level of experimentation, creativity, and hard work, you will figure it out. And so there's like, you know, I mentioned this before, but like channeling the younger version of myself, like what would I have told that person, or even vice versa in a way. So yeah.
I love that advice. And actually going back and listening to Tim Ferriss at my point that I was on, I think it was like episode 320 or something, was a Tim Ferriss call-in show. And I was listening to that and I was like, oh, I should do a call-in show. And so then I did, and that'll be episode 337. So it's just funny how you can get ideas from people's journeys as well. You know, you have a tweet here I want to talk to you about, which is, anyone else constantly oscillate between complete conviction that they can and should make a dent in the world, but also the realization that we are but a speck of dust in the universe. It kind of speaks to what you're talking about right now. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I oscillate between this honestly daily, because sometimes I wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, like it's not even just like go work hard today. It's seeing all the things that are happening, from like AI to longevity to like becoming a multiplanetary species, and I'm like, and I'm doing a what? You know? And it's not to be dismissive of what I do or really what anyone else does, but it's this like, oh my gosh, you could be doing so much more. And then there's another layer to that, which is like, we truly as a human species are but a speck of dust in like the wider galaxy. But then sometimes I oscillate the other direction, where it's like, well, that's not a very productive perspective to just be like, who cares? Like, we are here for whatever reason. And it's like, I think actually the more productive perspective is the other one, which is just like, actually, like, let's not have so much judgment about like the scope or scale of your impact. Go do the things that you're excited about. And if those happen to make a big impact, if you want that, great. But like, let's not be so judgmental about like what even the term big impact means, or like, you know, even I think there's sometimes judgment around like, oh, if you're not charitable, like, you know, you're not a good person, or like, is creating a SaaS company, is that like impactful as much as like, you know, going to eradicate a disease? There's like, do you get what I'm saying? There's a level of judgment that everyone has where they say like, this is a good cause, this is a bad cause, or like what you're doing is important, but like podcasting is unimportant. And I think that like, if you actually remove that might give you more space to be like, oh, what am I excited about? And maybe within that, there's an area where you're like, oh, I'm actually really proud of what I can accomplish here in the limited time that we have.
Well, speaking about impact, you started scholarships for 2021, right? You put out a bunch of different scholarships.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that decision. How did you decide to do that?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I went through college, like I said, I ended up with a bunch of debt, but I would have ended up with even more had I not been on scholarships. I will say I was not on, you know, a lot of people will like enter university on like, you know, 4-year scholarship or something, and they're like set. I didn't have any of that. It was very much like, oh, I'm in second year. Let me see what, you know, $500 scholarships, $1,000 scholarships are out there. Let me apply. Let me write the essays. And I think I got like, I don't know how many, but at least like 10 scholarships throughout my time there, because I was doing the work. And I think quite frankly, some of them, just a lot of people didn't want to write the essay or like didn't want to spend the time. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because that really like got me through school. But I also think there's this element of, I talked about this before, but like feeling special, like feeling like, oh, I won this scholarship. Like maybe that actually means like I can do something in the world, or that people see something in me. And my husband has done even more scholarships than I have, and he's actually had, in some cases, more of like a mentorship role with whoever he selects. And he does that because he's also seen like an even further extension of what I just described, which is like he worked with a mentor, like someone who believed in him when he was in high school, and he grew up like even poorer than I did, and then ended up going to Princeton really because of this person like sticking with him, like helping him, mentoring him, seeing the belief in him. And so yeah, I did that for a year because I thought it was, one, a good way to give back, but also like something where I felt like there was some emotion. Like I know there's like, again, some judgment some people have on effective altruism, for example. And I felt like this was a nice way where it's like, I can not only give back, but I, you know, selfishly can feel like I'm actually seeing who I'm impacting.
Yeah, it's so funny because it makes me think that the action of giving a scholarship is not just about the money. It's about also the belief and the wink of like, no, you're worthy of accomplishing whatever goal you set your mind to because you've been selected as this. And the scholarship can just be a way for people to get that feeling, which is a fascinating thing that I've never thought about before. Yeah.
And on top of that, I mean, you read these essays, so we'd have to go through a bunch of essays to like decide who won. And you would see a bunch of essays where either this person has just like grown up with really incredible education, or in some cases maybe literally like a tutor or a parent would write the essay. And I would always ignore those because I know those people have the resources. And I would often see these essays where like I could tell that this person almost like hasn't been given a chance. I don't know if this makes sense, but like you can tell
How did you know?
They're not, well, I don't know. You see their background, you see like where they've gone to school, you see like what clubs and things they've participated in, you can see their GPA. So you can kind of see like what any, you know, let's say admissions officer could see, but you could also like, you ask what you want the essay to be about. And sometimes you can just tell that like, you know, this person doesn't have the perfect grammar. This hasn't been reviewed by some like professional editor. They haven't won awards in the past, but you can see this like inkling, and you might be wrong, to be clear, but like those are the profiles that I would try to look out for of like kind of like previous me, like someone who didn't have all the resources, like what little seeds can I look for that this person with even just that little bit of belief that you just spoke to might actually go on and do much bigger things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I really admire that you would look at the world that way. What other ways have you found to spot talent or spot talented people?
Yeah, so it sounds simple, but the best way is just to see what people do when no one's looking. So, you know, if you think about the typical interview process for almost any job, and this is changing, it's to literally ask someone if they're going to be good at a job, which is kind of crazy that we rely on, you know, someone telling us, someone being convincing. But the best talent I've ever seen is like, you know, someone like you, Danny. What do you do in your free time? You create a podcast, you focus on growing it, you focus on honing in your craft, and you do it for 300 episodes. Like that's a lot more data, a lot more relevant data than someone sitting in a room and telling me like, yeah, like I did this in my old job, and like, this is how I think about X. It's just, I mean, it's not so much that interviews are useless, but it's more just like, go find the person on Twitter who's like on their own accord saying really interesting things, who on their own accord or started a newsletter that is impressive and is on a topic that like no one else has the courage to cover. Things like that are, I think, the best way. And then a very simple kind of addition to that is just, if you're looking to hire someone, we have the tools today where you don't need to bring them on as a W-2 immediately. Give them a test project, pay them for the test project, and you see real quick if someone can do the work that you want them to do.
So true. Are there any people in particular who are up and coming right now who you feel like, oh, in 5 years, 10 years, I would bet on this person?
Ooh, I mean, I feel like some of them have already blown up a little bit, but like, I'm sure you've seen like Dan Toomey from Morning Brew. He does these like social clips. He's someone where I'm like, you should be on SNL. Like I literally, I saw, this is kind of random, but I did this tweet thread last year that went really viral, and then it got Trevor Noah to like follow me, and I was like, maybe I should DM Trevor Noah and just like send, you know, speaking of what we said before of like helping other people out even when they don't know, or complimenting them. I was like, maybe I should just like DM Trevor Noah and tell him about this guy, you know, things like that. And so there are people where,
did you do that?
No, I should. Maybe I'll do this after. I wasn't sure if it'd be weird, but I also was like, Trevor Noah's never gonna, you know, like read my DM to him. But yeah, I mean, actually, I don't know if we talked about this on our last podcast, but there have been many times in my life where I had that reaction of like, oh, and this person's never gonna read this, or this person's never gonna, you know, say yes to whatever, and then they have. So maybe I should do it. I should take my own advice and just like DM these people that I think will never respond. I'm trying to think of other folks that this is the case for. There was a guy at The Hustle. His name's Jacob Cohen. He's another guy who I'm just like, you know, getting to work with him. He's going to be a star. He runs, or he's on the Hustle Daily Show, their podcast. But I'll have to come back to you. There's so many people who I see all the time where I'm like, I would hire you if I could, but I know you're probably not looking for work because you're that talented. So that is the complication of all this.
And what are those traits specifically that you're finding in those people?
Yeah, so I think we talked about courage before, but it's like they're willing to put something out there that like you can tell comes from a place where they haven't spent 50 years on this earth, and they don't like, they're not worried in a way about how they might be perceived or what may be misinterpreted or this like persona that they're trying to give off. They're just having fun. So I think that's something that I think is important. And you can, I mean, it's a taste thing, but you can get a sense of that. I think I also look for just like frequency. Especially if you're scouting someone external, it's like, you know, at what frequency are they putting stuff out there? Like that tells you a lot about kind of their work ethic, but also their excitement around what they're doing. And that also plays a role. Like I talked about them having fun. You can tell when people just like what they're doing. It comes through in like the color of their work. And so I think that's important as well. And I think another part of this isn't really what you were asking, but like I think a lot of the time people look for folks that have done exactly what they're looking to hire for. But we've retrained people so many times where it's like, oh, you find someone who's really smart and creative, and if they're willing to do it, it's like you can put them in kind of like in a new industry or doing research on a topic they've never heard of before. And it doesn't always work, but I think there's also like this, people look for someone with like X years of experience. And from my experience, that's especially with the world moving so quickly, it's often better to hire someone who's young and scrappy and who's excited to figure it out.
Well, that certainly reminds me of yourself. And it reminds me also of a tweet you have, which is, one of the best decisions I've ever made was learning to code. It took me 300 hours to change my life. And the reason why it reminds me of that is because you think of yourself as an engineer and technical person, and then here you are podcasting and writing, and those are two different dichotomies. And it's like you've picked up the second because you were able to learn things really quickly and learn things really well.
Yeah. But see, that's another example where I think if you, and this is not to like rule someone out or like pass judgment on people who don't have these like disparate interests, but if someone literally is like, I've been doing this one job for 10 years and I don't have any hobbies or interests or things that I just pursued just because, like, I think that really is a filter. And just like, what are people doing when you're not asking them to? Do they have the passion or the excitement to be like, it doesn't have to be coding. It could be like collecting coins or like traveling to like a hot sauce convention. I don't know. I don't even know if some of this exists, but like there are people who just like bring a level of like intrigue to the world. And if you are the type of person where, again, like all you're interested in is like getting paid for the expertise you've held for X amount of time, that's less interesting to me. I'm very inspired by people who like, again, it doesn't need to be learning to code, but just on their own accord. They go people and want to do things. I know it sounds simple, but yeah, people who do stuff. And it's not hard to spot them if you just like have that frame.
That's facts. That's so true. How'd you convince your husband to code?
Well, he just started the last couple days. So I didn't convince him really. I guess in a way I did, but I interviewed Amjad from Replit. And for years I've been trying to convince Calvin to learn to code because you know, I should clarify. It's not like I'm paid for any engineering work. It's not like I'm probably even a good at all developer, but I can build things. And for me, that was a really important unlock. And I talked to Amjad about this. He's the founder of Replit. And there we talked about AI and this question of whether it's still worth it. And so if people are curious, that's one of our most popular episodes. And that episode Cal listened to, and despite me like asking him in many other ways or like nudging him over the years, the other day he's like, oh, I'm like taking that 100 Days of Python course. Like, I think I'm going to finish it in 20 days. And I was like, great. No complaints. Like, I'm not, whatever happened here, like, you keep going. And it was because of that episode.
Well, that's such a fascinating thing to think about as a podcast host, is like your nudges of telling that person to do something, or that didn't do it. But what actually did it was them listening to a podcast.
It's a theme from this conversation, isn't it? It's like, you know, not saying something to someone directly, but like this like periphery, like what do you hear? What do you hear other people talking about? And yeah, I guess it's another example of that.
Well, I think the reason for that is because it makes someone feel as if they're coming to the decision on their own.
Yes.
Right? They get the chance to listen to it, and then they're like, oh, should I not? But it gives them the ability or the illusion of control over their own decision making.
Exactly.
Which is a fascinating thing. So I want to talk to you about content, because you're content queen, and you had a really interesting point in your talk at, I believe, the ConvertKit Summit, which is that the power of content is not to sell the content, it's to develop a narrative for which you can sell on top of. And I had to play that back a few times when I was listening to this. I'm like, what does that mean? The power of content is not to sell the content, it's to develop a narrative for which you can sell on top of. So I'd love for you to expand on that idea a little more and really develop it, because it was an unlock for me. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for listening to that. Yeah, I think it's a misunderstanding for a lot of people who create content, because, well, I should clarify, you can sell content and many people are successful at selling content. But from my experience and also analysis of many content businesses, and by the way, Hello Kitty is a content business, right? I'm not just talking about Substacks. It's a lot easier to build up a large audience and then sell something else. And there's many reasons this is true. One of them is that people just have a perception of what certain buckets of things in the world should cost. So for example, a book, even if it's the best book in the world, people are going to laugh if you say it costs $1,000. They're even going to like be shocked if it costs $100, $80, right? Like it's not the expectation that we have. Meanwhile, a cohort-based course may actually deliver less value. It may deliver more value, but all of a sudden people aren't laughing at 100, and they're also in some cases not laughing at 1,000 or 8,000, right? So there's an expectation around what you offer and society's expectation of what that should cost. And so with that said, unfortunately, or you could say fortunately, you could also just say it's the market we have today, supply and demand. There's a lot of people who want to create content. Well, a lot of people aren't willing to pay for that content. And even if they are, it's typically like in very specific scenarios where maybe they pay for one gated podcast, maybe one gated newsletter, maybe two, but like find me someone who pays for 15 paid newsletters. Like, I don't think that person exists, or it's like 0.00001% of the world. And so with that said, it's harder in a way because it takes more time and it can take more effort to produce products that are adjacent to your content, but you can make way more money on that often than actually selling the content. And another important dynamic that's part of that is because as soon as you start selling your content, I mean, this is obvious, but you're gating it, right? Like you're withholding it from growing or becoming viral in the way that it can. And so you can build up like a funnel, and at the end of that funnel is like a paid newsletter or some form of paid content. But you can, you're seeing tons of creators do this. They're like, oh, I write about like celebrity homes. Maybe I'll actually go create like a SaaS product for real estate agents or something, right? Like something related. And it could be software, it could be a physical product. But I think maybe the data point that always resonates with people is if you look up the biggest content franchises, could be Harry Potter, it could be Star Wars, it could be Hello Kitty. They make a majority of their money through merch. not through the content. And Hello Kitty is one of the biggest franchises in the world. And like, there's not really like traditional Hello Kitty content. There is some, but I think there's some crazy statistic where it's like, there's like 60,000, maybe even 80,000 products around the world that are branded with Hello Kitty. It could be like a lunchbox. It could be a baseball bat. It could be like a Kit Kat specially flavored. That's Hello Kitty version. But again, this is a narrative. Once you build up a narrative, people are willing to buy other things where they have a more standard expectation around cost that you can sell on top of that. And then again, you let your content business grow in this like blocked way.
What's interesting to me is that you mentioned 3 different franchises that are all based on fiction. And so many creators today are creating nonfiction stuff. But I've noticed a huge trend, I don't know if you have as well, of nonfiction writers going to fiction. A couple that come to mind are Nat Eliason, Tim Ferriss, Thomas Frank, like Nathan Baugh. Like, these are happening where it's like the smartest nonfiction writers are realizing, it seems like, okay, we can change people's perspectives through self-improvement content, but it's not going to actually make the sustained impact of billions of people the way that Harry Potter could. So have you noticed that trend as well?
I have definitely noticed that trend. And I think there's a couple important points to this, which is one, like nonfiction, a lot of the books say the same thing. Not all of them, but I think people get to that threshold because they're like, I've heard a lot of the same topics, even some of the same studies, and I believe it. But to your point, that doesn't mean they action it, and it's not like emotionally resonating with them. And so I got to that point. I actually haven't read as much recently because I got to that, like, we could even call it like the nonfiction cliff. I like fell off it, and then I'm like finding my way to fiction, right? But I think that's one of the reasons I think a lot of people weight the importance of narrative. And so even you're talking about, if you write a newsletter about cars, there's still a narrative embedded in that, right? You might be talking about the specs of a car, or let's say you're talking about the specs of a phone. There's still a narrative when people are listening in terms of like what's changing about the world. The type of person who's subscribing might really believe like they are, you know, an expert. No one understands the space. I'm the one who does, right? There's still a narrative embedded in all of that, embedded in why someone subscribes to something or doesn't. And we have this episode coming out tomorrow, but I just interviewed 2 of the people who created Lil Miquela, you know, the digital influencer. She was one of the first. And in 2016, it was the type of thing that a lot of people didn't think would work. But again, it's this idea, the most important thing that I took away from that interview was the importance of narrative. We're at the point where a lot of people can create similar digital influencers, but there were all these really smart things that they did about how they built that character that would make people want to follow her, right? As in like, as if she was a person. And so I think that's actually like, you know, we think about, we're in this technological age where you don't know what skills are important. Well, the skill that will always be important is learning how to build a narrative, because as we just talked about, there are infinite ways to spin that once you have people's attention.
Okay, so tell me, I'm so curious. We'll link that episode down below, but I'm curious, what are some of the things that they did to help get people's attention and to really hook them on Lil Miquela's story?
Yeah, so I think there was a few things, even just what sound like simple decisions, but like, what does she look like? When you start with a clean slate, because it's a digital human, you can make them look however they want. They made sure that there was kind of what sound like opposites, but I think fit together nicely. So one of them was that she could resonate with almost anyone. Like you see her and you're not sure what race she is. You're not sure exactly how old she is. And so she has this vibe where, again, anyone, whether it's you or I or someone who's like 30 or someone who's 12, could resonate with Lil Miquela. But they also added these like intentionally really iconic visual elements, like her space buns and her freckles, because even though she looks like she could resonate with anyone, people knew it was her every time they saw her, right? You take pictures of me online and you plop them in different places, they don't know it's me, right? Like a lot of my pictures look different. So that was another, again, really small thing, but that was really important. If you're going to build a narrative, people need something that's recognizable. And in some way, you could use the term iconic. But then they also, like, you see some people, again, with the AI tools today, they're like, let me just throw up a bunch of pictures of this person. but there's no narrative there. There's no story. So what they started to do is they started to say like, okay, let's give her a boyfriend, right? And like maybe in some cases, like I think the boyfriend was like a real life person, right? And
wow.
They start weaving in storytelling into the captions of like a true person talking about, oh, I'm dating this person. Oh, I'm in LA. Oh, now I'm at Coachella. So again, these like markers where people are all of a sudden starting, I mean, they know this person's not real, but they are starting to resonate with the story of like what's going to happen next. And they said the reason, or one of the reasons that they realized it was working, is because at some point people started writing fan fiction where they literally were like, you know, Michaela's not dating this person. Actually, Michaela's dating this person and she has a secret relationship with this person, things like that. And so you can imagine that if you don't give people these like cornerstones of a story of who a person is, what they believe in, what they don't believe in, they're not going to invent those narratives. And so again, it sounds simplistic, but it was actually like an aha moment for me, because again, a lot of people can create these characters today, but they don't think about how they build that narrative that actually will resonate with people. They just think about what the person looks like on the surface.
That's super cool. Thank you for sharing that. And also it points to an idea that I've had for quite some time, which is like, do you want to figure out if someone is resonating with something? Is if they create content on top of the thing that you've created. So when I started seeing the podcast clicking for people was when I started seeing other people who were listening creating something from it, like whether that's their own threads about it or their own essays or quotes on Instagram. It's like that is the greatest sign something is working, is if people are creating something on top of the thing that you've created.
It's so true, because I mean, especially since I wrote my book, a lot of people, you know, they'll be like, I'm starting a newsletter, or maybe actually the more common question is, I've been running this for 6 months, or insert amount of time here. How do I know if it's working? What open rate should I look for? What click rate? What growth rate? And I'm like, I can look at all that. I can give you benchmarks, but I know it's not what you want to hear. People will let you know if you're creating something worthwhile. They will let you know. And I've done that across so many of my projects where like you're in those early phases, and because I have that previous experience, I know when it's not working because I'm not hearing it. And then you test and then, okay, I found it. Because again, people let you know. You've experienced this. Every creator that, you know, has had some level of success has experienced this. People will DM you. They'll create new content on top of your content, like you're saying. They'll tell someone else and you'll hear about it. They'll leave a review even without you asking. Those are the moments that people should be looking for. It's not necessarily in some bar chart, but it's like, that's when you know.
What are some of the common mistakes you see new creators such a loaded term, but new tweeters, let's say, or newsletter writers, since those are the areas I feel like you're very familiar with? What are the common mistakes you see those people make in, let's say, the first 6 months?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like Twitter is hard these days because there's a lot of things that I would advise against, and people have grown accounts very successfully with. But even there, like as an example, a lot of people will really like hook on to certain tactics. They'll be like, oh, threads work right now, or AI works as a topic. But I think, you know, I've been tweeting for years now, and I've seen so many people, and this is true for newsletters as well, where it's really easy to hook on to some, like, you know, the thing of today or the thing of the month. But those things fade, or they change, or more importantly, you probably, if you're just doing it for that reason, you'll lose interest. And so I think it's important for people to find topics that they are uniquely interested in, but then also have like, whether it's like a unique data set that they understand better, or like they understand how to use certain tools better, or something like that they can actually stick with. Because again, a lot of creators will like come and go, is what I've seen on Twitter, who follow those like kind of hacky techniques. But the other part, and this applies more so to, you could say, long form writing or podcasting, is just, we might have talked about this last podcast, but like how you create content instead of what you're actually creating content about. And so a lot of people will be like, I'm going to create a travel blog, or I'm going to create a newsletter about the latest phones or hardware. And that's okay, but trust me, there's a lot of people who have created everything you can think of. And so you need to find your angle. Maybe yours, Danny, is like, I do more research than anyone. We go to a depth that like no one's heard of, right? But there's other podcasts where it's like that's not their shtick. Maybe their shtick is being extremely funny, Maybe it's like bringing more data to the table than you can even imagine. Maybe it's really short and snippy and it's only like 5 minutes, but you just get the best bits. But point is, people focus too much on what they're creating and not how. And, you know, we talked about how you know you're doing well. It's people telling you. Well, trust me, like, Danny, has anyone ever said, I love your podcast? Like, I just love that you have an interview style podcast. No. Same way no one would ever be like, I love your travel blog, you talk about travel. No, they'd be like, oh my gosh, you go to all the destinations no one goes to, or you make this so easy and simple. And so I think that's another way where people go wrong. They think too much about the what instead of the how.
That's beautiful. Beautiful insight. What are the similarities between traveling and creating content on the internet? Forever in the air.
Oh no. Please, let's not link that. Well, that's actually like a great example of, we talked about when I was young, just didn't care. So I started an Instagram and I was just curious. This was before, it's not like I was so early, but it was before creating an Instagram account was really seen as like something you would do as a business, let's say. And so I was traveling and I had just traveled 4 months around the world post-college. So I had all these pictures and then I was dying in my consulting role. And so I was commuting 2 hours a day. And on that bus ride, that's when I was doing my Instagram thing. And I grew that account to what sounds not big now, but it was meaningful back then, 5,000 followers. And then I decided I didn't want to do it anymore. But that's the kind of like confidence back then where I was just like, let me just try this, but also like, who cares if it doesn't work? And also now that it's working, like, let me just like give it up kind of attitude. But so travel and content, I think something that is important with content that I guess is like kind of hand wavy is just, I've heard Sam say this before, but it's like, do you have interesting experiences? I know that sounds very silly, but it's like, do you have an interesting perspective? And often that perspective is formed off of things you've seen, people you've talked to, mistakes you've made. And I think travel is maybe the best way to do that in like a really concentrated way. And I even think back, I mean, a lot of the writing I did was when I was traveling. And I think it's because I was more inspired. I was more, it sounds silly, but I was doing things, right? Like I was seeing things and being exposed to new perspectives. So I think, like, I don't know if there's so much a parallel between like travel and creating content, but I think actually travel is like a great example of what it takes to have a unique perspective, which is important for content.
Because when you're traveling, you're literally embodying in different perspectives, which makes you a more interesting human, which allows you to create better content. I love that so much. What are some of the things that someone could do what are some of the ways we can get better as travelers? So I'm constantly on the road. I'm constantly going places, but I don't think about what are the best ways to travel. Do you have anything that comes to mind?
Oh, I mean, I think you could say nomad. And when I say nomad in this case, I'm talking about people who are like on the road a lot. From my experience, can't do that for long because I mean, there's all these tips and tricks and things you can probably incorporate, but it's exhausting. And so that's actually like from seeing so many people do that. I don't know, maybe you've just got the energy, but like what I would say is like you could call it, some people say slow matting. Longer term travel is what most people end up gravitating towards because if you think about it, travel is like this romantic thing where it's like I get to see the world and I still love doing it, but it's also kind of counter to many of the things that humans desire, which is like community, routine, exercise. And it's so funny, like I haven't updated it because I just haven't had the time, but I used to release my exercise. Like if I exercise in a given day, I used to release that because I track it every day. And like you can see when I'm traveling, it's when I'm not exercising because I just, even after many years, I really struggled to balance the two.
So what should somebody who wants to optimize their travel do? Like what are a few hacks or a few ways of thinking or being if I'm going to be on the road in terms of just helping myself navigate it most effectively?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you can, I know it's like, it sounds simple, but like add a couple days, add a couple weeks. Like I just think it's when you travel somewhere for a couple days, or some people will like literally go, let's say for a conference and then leave. Like, you're not really seeing anything from the place. And again, it's really hard to establish any of the things that humans are looking for. And so that's one thing. I also think if people are really looking to start traveling like more full time, as in they've given up their apartment, they've like, they're trying to go find the next place, that's when actually exploring more rapidly makes sense. But even then, I would recommend people start in like what I would call these like nomad hubs, where there's a lot of other people looking to do the same thing, because then you have your best shot at actually establishing some semblance of community and meeting people quickly, and maybe even finding travel partners to go on your voyage with. So I would say like Canggu is one of those, Chiang Mai is one of those, Lisbon, Medellin. There's a lot of them around the world, but that's another thing that I would recommend.
Didn't you create a website based on that?
So I didn't. Peter Levels has Nomad List. So that's kind of related, where my data point in mentioning those was like literally the concentration of nomads, but he created a website that incorporates, I think, some semblance of that, but also other data points like weather, internet speed, safety, cost of living. And so it's like, I think they're directionally correct, because at the end of the day, that's what a bunch of nomads are looking for, which is why they have the highest concentration in those places. Got
you. You didn't have a project that had to do with nomading?
Well, so it was called Nomad Hub. That was my very first project. That one was for like nomad trips, which actually I should check in on how those are doing, because this is like years, I was just before my time. But they basically, there's these companies that would create trips, because there is this problem, this job to be done, which is that a lot of people want to go and see many parts of the world, but they don't want to do it alone, and they want community. So there's many companies that do this, like Remote Year, Wi-Fi Tribe, and I created back then a like directory of those, so you could see in a given month like who's going to be anywhere in January, and then you could also sort by continent. Let's say like, oh, I really want to go to Africa, not many of these trips go there, so what are the ones going and what month are they in? And so that was literally the first project that I made on my own.
That's Nomad Hub, and people could check that out. It's still up there.
It's still there. It's not updated, but it's you can see. If you want to see like what a very early first coding project looks like, I think it looks nice. It's not mobile optimized, but it's old. It was created in 2018. Is that right? I think so. Or 2019. But several years old.
We'll link that down below. Super cool. I'm so grateful for you. We like to end these podcasts with challenges. That's the final question. So what is a challenge we can leave people with to take some action in their day, so that it's not just consuming the information, it's also acting and doing something from it?
Go say something nice about someone to someone else. And then I'm going to go, I don't expect this to get a response, but I'm going to go message Trevor Noah and go, I think really we should extend this idea of like just a compliment, but like how nice is it to like recommend a friend for a job, or like just create opportunities for other people. And then, as we talked about, like, especially if they don't know, maybe don't volunteer your friends for everything, but
Well, doing nice things with no expectations, or doing kind things with no expectations, is really a way to feel so whole inside, because when we give things, we get the same, I think, neurotransmitter lights up when we receive a gift, which is a fascinating thing to think about. And one is in our control at all times. Giving is always in our control. So I love that so much.
Yeah. There's a quote about that where it's like, when you give a gift, who benefits more? And it's like, it's true. So more giving. It sounds so cheesy, but I like the frame of actually giving without like anyone knowing, kind of thing.
Yeah. Or any expectation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Where can we send people to connect with you further, other than the A16Z podcast and
I appreciate you plugging for me. Yeah, so you mentioned the podcast, my Twitter. My website is stephsmith.io, so you can find all my projects. My book's called Doing Content Right, and you can find all the other projects like Nomad Hub, which you dug up, my very first project from back in the day.
I love it. And hopefully we'll have you back on for an in-person episode somewhere around the 600 range.
Oh my gosh. Well, at the speed you're doing these, isn't that going to be like next month or something?
Yeah, not quite. A few years, but so excited, so grateful for you. Thank you so much, Steph.
Thank you, and
You're the
congrats
best.
on the success on this podcast.
Thank you. And congrats on all your success as well.
Thank you.